Okay. Well, thanks everyone for coming, and we record these because all of our programs are on a PNWAS channel, so you can go back and watch any of the programs that we've done through the years. But thanks for coming, and we might have people to mute their unless they want to say something, because we're getting some background noise. But anyhow, the good news is I've spent a lot of the summer nominating Ed Carrier, the Suquamish elder and master basket weaver that I've worked with for years and who's given many presentations for PNWAS. But I nominated him for a National Heritage Fellowship with the National Endowment for the Arts. And it's quite a process, but we want to get him national recognition. And I think we have a pretty good chance we really won't hear about it till beginning of or towards summer, whether he actually gets the award, the fellowship. So that I think is good news. He deserves national attention. He's one of the only master basket weavers that's worked directly with archaeological basketry and incorporated in his work to bring back through what we call generationally linked archaeology, the old style Salish baskets for hundreds of generations for everyone to learn from. The other good news is my granddaughter turned 1.5 years. Here's her picture, a lot of resemblance. Out of a pumpkin patch, and I'll get to see her Saturday, but she's starting to learn words now. So anyway, I think that's pretty good news, and Jan Smith thinks she's beautiful, right? Anyway, but thanks for coming. I think it's interesting to me that Duncan came in, but it's partly because cordage as an artifact is not part of the mainstream in archaeology, even though it's very common in sites. You see a couple that Duncan has found in that site they're working on. But there are thousands. There's usually thousands in a wet site, and quite ancient. A site that Duncan McLaren's partner in excavation excavated in southern Queen Charlotte's that I'll show you on Darrell Fedgy is 10,700 years old. So they can be very ancient, and they're very numerous. You know, it wasn't real common at Mud Bay. There's 260 pieces of cordage, but you know, some of those are massive nets, and we just consider those one artifact, you know, instead of counting every net string. And in 11 years of working at Mud Bay, we only found 50 projectile points. So you compare that to 260 cordage pieces, including big nets. It's a very common artifact, and also it's common in Eastern Washington in dry cave sites. I'll show you some examples of that. And they find hundreds of pieces of cordage in sites like McGregor Cave, and up to 3,000 years old. And then frozen sites have an awful lot as well. On our coast, in some of the frozen sites, and up into the north. This is a piece of cordage that I replicated. It's made of cedar bark, but you can see some of the complexities. I noticed on Duncan's handle that it looked like 3-strand cedar limb, and most of the cordage up north anyway in the central coast is cedar bark, like in Simpson and some of the sites in the Bella Coola area. Our area, it's not cedar bark, but it's cedar limb usually, which is a tougher material. You can see different characteristics. I said it was 3-strand. If you try to undo it a little bit, you can kind of count out the 3 strands, and that's another characteristic. And probably one of the main characteristics, and Duncan's had that too, is the Zlay is real common on the Northwest coast. It's like that. So it creates a Z instead of an S if it was going the other way. And you can get all kinds of construction techniques. They've been found, cordage recently was found last year in Spain in a Neanderthal site. So these are people who are not anatomically modern like you and I. And they found on a Levalloisian flake through residue analysis, a 3-strand piece of cordage that Neanderthals made that is with cambium. It's made of a bark, not unlike this, with 3 strands, and it's Zlay. And I mean, that's just the way it was done. And it was found on a Levalloisian flake. These are the kind of things that Neanderthals excelled in, was this kind of core, a Levalloisian core, which is called a turtle-shaped core. And you can get the idea why that's the case here, where the flakes are taken off the side, and then a purchase is made, and then pow, you knock off a real nice Levalloisian flake, and it's on one of these flakes. It's represented in that cordage book from a paper in 2020 that had a little piece of that. I don't think it was rope, but 3-strand cordage preserved in a dry cave in a Neanderthal site. And these were individuals who were not really a whole lot like, I mean, they certainly are able to interbreed with you and I, and we, if you're of European descent, you probably, like myself, have 2 or 3% Neanderthal genes. But they were twice our strength. These are people who you wouldn't want to mess with. They had a nasal cavity that couldn't be shut off when they talked, you know, so they probably had some kind of communication. They had to have some way of learning these different things, but it certainly can be done by observation. But if you ever try to talk without closing your nose, you'll get an idea of how a Neanderthal could talk. So they could talk like this, and you can probably understand me. But they couldn't, you know, because of that, they couldn't do vowels and then many consonants. So they were a bit different, definitely, than you and I. But they, by looking at the fact that they have this kind of cordage, they had some idea of how to deal with plants as well as stones in converting something off a tree into a usable tool or artifact. They had some idea of numbers. I mean, if you're dealing with making a 3-strand cord, you have to be able to deal with the fact that you want it to come out. And it's not that easy doing 3-strand cord, but that you want it to come out a bit stronger than a 2-strand cordage. I think Duncan's root cordage is probably 2-strand, but I think the handles got into a 3-strand. And then you have to be able to know that you twist each of the elements clockwise, and then you lay them together counterclockwise, and it's therefore it becomes spring loaded. It therefore is going to really hold up, and it held up in this Neanderthal site for about 35,000 years. And so there's these kind of perceptions that cordage can tell you that these earliest pre-modern, anatomically modern humans were quite able to do. The kinds of cordage that we'll be looking at from Hosette is cedar limb, oftentimes, not cedar bark. So here's a cedar limb I got, my wife helped me get today, and it's made with a twisting technique which creates which creates the single element that you can lay together with with other pieces. And this is laid, I mean, this is twisted in a clockwise fashion. All the single strand withes that you lay together with other limbs, twisted limbs, are twisted clockwise. Here's one that is a little better. So I'm gonna have to go clockwise and twist this, but it's a very strong material compared to cedar bark. And these are the main element in tying together the Hosette and other longhouses. So this is what you'll see as the element that ties together the double poles so they can sling in the planks in the longhouse. So it's 25% of the cordage that I recorded from Hosette. And it's usually done with tied together with a sheet bend knot, which is easy to take apart. I'll just do an overhand knot here, but it's a common artifact, and it's the basis for making the harpoon lines. These things are not easy to twist, and typically what's done is these are put into a bull kelp stem and then put in under a fire to steam them. So the kelp will protect this bough, and then when you take it out, it's steamed and softened, and you can get a much tighter twist than I could get by doing this by hand. You can kind of see the twist there where I twisted it clockwise. And one of the mystery artifacts I mentioned in the communications is common. There's 74 of these at Hosette, and it's done with a braid. That's a different technique. You can see the nice braid here by splitting cedar branches in half and then braiding them together. So you take just a cedar branch like this, but you need 3 elements to braid. So you twist, you essentially split this in half, and you do it to 2 branches, so you come up with 3 of them. And there's one that's already split, but then you have to twine them together, and you end up with a piece like this with three elements nicely braided together. I think you can see that. So any idea what this is? Why do you have 74 of these in the Hosette Longhouse? Any idea? I think you have to unmute to let me know. Any thoughts? This one, the mystery artifact. Are you still with me? But anyway.
Maybe for brushing off.
For what? I don't hear.
Brushing off.
Yeah, brush.
Brushing off.
Yeah, it's probably a brush. And they really kept the floors at Hosette nice and clean, brought in boxes full of sand and resurfaced them, and cleaning off bed benches. But a lot of them are burnt along this edge too. So, and they have been found around hearths. So you're probably getting your rocks white hot, brushing off the soot before you take a tong and put it into the box of water to steam your dried food. So it's a useful brush, kind of a brush. Here's one I did 6 months ago, and it shows you it's dried out, but the branches don't fall off. It holds up pretty well. I do make a mess around the house, but it's long lived too, because cedar holds together real well. Okay, well, let's get going in the slideshow, and then we'll get a bit of an idea of how this artifact is is incorporated into the Northwest Coast archaeology, as well as into a household. It's a household archaeology artifact. If I can get everything to work here, but okay, you got to tell me if you see the. Do you see the full screen here, or is it a series of slides along the bottom? Does that work, Matt?
Got to hit swap displays.
Swap. Okay. Now do you see it? The full screen?
Yes, we can see it.
So that works. Okay, good. So just a little business. This is cedar limb. This let me get this laser on. But this is cedar limb, this whale harpoon rope. It has to be real high tensile strength for how they're using them to capture whale. Little business, our next talk, which I think Duncan, who does a lot of this kind of coring and all, is a new professor at WSU, Dr. John C Blong, and he's working in this part of Alaska where you have Cook Inlet and a lot of artifacts being found. He does a lot of environmental work, coring and macroflora and microflora. But this, if you look at where it's located, could be a good place to venture into the coastal areas during glacial periods. And this is the environment today, which is an alpine tundra, which would be probably pretty much what we would see here after glaciation in the Chehalis River Valley area or up by Lake Winol. Not much vegetation, pretty open. The artifacts we'd be talking about are these macro blades and bifaces that are fairly curious. So it goes along with our look at the entrance of people into the coastal areas and moving down the coast. The next one is on reconstructing Holocene human landscape interactions in the area around the Olympics, particularly the lower Elwha, where they're digging an early Cascade or Olcott site that's 11,000 years old. But Megan Walsh, who's out of Central Washington University, did a bunch of coring on what's Beaver Lake above Hokel River. If you come down from Sappho Forks, you go by Beaver Lake, and her and her crew from Central came and did cores, and they're looking for fire history, something that Tyler's quite interested in, has written in our reports about the fire history, some major forest fires, which could be intentionally started to clear off areas. But she's at Hoke on the big yurt deck, working on her sediment cores with her husband Kevin here. So the volume is available if you're interested in getting it through. You can go directly to the publisher, the Journal of Northwest Anthropology, and that's, if you don't like to go to Amazon, it helps the publisher out if you get it, and it's only $24.95. This is a spruce root string here, Duncan. It looks really similar the way it's platy at the end, like the cordage you found up the Fraser. Let's get an idea of the time span. Like I say, Daryl Fedge and his crew, people that work with Duncan here at the south end of Heidick Way, have a really nice nice spruce root braid that's 10,700 years old. I'll show you. But down in up the Fraser, the Glen Rooks cannery site is 4,500 years old, and it has cordage, and then of course Hosette that we'll be looking at, it's about 300 years old. Numbers of cordage are very high, over 2,300 from Hoko River here, the largest number on the coast, and 2,000, a little over 2,000 at Hosette. A hectare is 761. It's up here. So you get pretty good numbers. Water Hazard, which is a pond that was where they did rescue work because they dredged a pond and they got 761 pieces of cordage. And our site at Mud Bay is 260 down in the very south of Puget Sound. And like I say, in 11 years, we only found 50 projectile points. So these kind of numbers at Cookwass reflect well in terms of comparative purposes, you know, to compare between sites. Again, Eastern Washington has an awful lot of basketry and cordage, particularly cordage in these dry cave sites. And David might have been to some of these. But just for an example, McGregor Cave here has 651 pieces of cordage in it, and 189 pieces of matting, which is usually sewn together with cordage or twined with cordage, and 4 baskets. And this site dates to 3,000 years ago. So there's plenty of the artifact out there. Certainly cordage, and this individual, Rihanna, did her master's thesis on this, and she could see in the vantage area here an immediate switch from what I was saying as Z-laid cordage to primarily S-laid cordage, which means almost has to mean there's a different community coming into the area, because usually for millennia the way you twist cordage is consistent, but she doesn't know where this S twist came from. And that's something that you can look at and see if there's population replacement. Oh, here's Daryl with this braid that's 10,700 years old from Kilgee Way. And it is very small. It's a thread. And my thought is they probably at that time were dealing with a lot of leather clothing. A lot of the fauna are bears. And so you need a sewing element to sew together the clothing or the boats. They're probably leather boats. And the other is this flat strap cordage wrapping this stick for some reason, these sticks, which is a form of cordage that's 10,700. So that's Paleo-Indian. We're talking about very early people along the coast, and we're seeing their perishables well preserved in wet sites. So let's look at Hosette, which is a whole house under a mudslide, and we'll basically be looking at house 1, which in outline is 40 feet wide and 60 feet long. They're massive. There's all kinds of bed benches here, lots of roof boards that have lips to be placed in Spanish tile fashion across the roof, cross beams and upright posts. And this isn't cordage, this is our excavation hoses. But lots of beautiful household possessions like this true loom, and your means of transportation, the paddles, these distinctive Macaw style dripless paddles, as well as clubs, seal clubs for dispatching the fur seals. Once you harpoon them and bring them next to the canoe, you dispatch them by crushing their skulls. And we found lots of that in terms of every fur seal skull was crushed. We'll be looking at really just these 2 houses, particularly house 1 and a bit of house 3 here. And the mudslide came down and covered this whole area. So we've excavated only this much. of this whole site, so maybe 10%. And so plenty is left here for future archaeologists. This shows their whaling tradition, bringing in a whale here, supported by sealskin floats, a lot of rope involved with that, plus tow ropes, and then bringing it up to butcher it. Wada Island here, which kind of looks like a drop on this map, is a lookout area, so you can watch for whales, and those are becoming more important for coastal investigations, just seeing how these lookouts and defensive areas were built. These squares here actually have the oldest dates from Hosette, which is about 2,000 years old. The rest of it, and particularly these houses, are 300 years old. But I should point out that we dug down in this house another 2 to 3 meters and found an 800-year-old house under the earlier mudslide. So there's a couple of, and we never have been able to really investigate that house very much. This is the house we'll really look at in terms of the maps. And you can see how the boards were just scattered by this tremendous mudslide. House 1 here we'll look at, and then in behind is house 2 here, and better showing it here with the family hearth and the cross beams with a family hearth. So we'll really look at the cordage from this house, and you can see these cross beams in the site with a notch around the base that slips into this C notch on top of the upright posts that go along this one is actually this one on the in the house, and some of the Spanish drawings of the way these houses looked on the inside. Like I said, this withe I showed you, here's a good example of it from Hosette, are tied between double rows of poles. There are 2 poles, and then you tie the withe across and creates a sling for the roof, the wall boards, split cedar wall boards. And Hillary Stewart nicely shows how these are twisted, and you do normally twist them clockwise and lay them counterclockwise to come up with a Zlay. This is what Captain Cook shows, 1776, of the Nootka Sound village with those kinds of plank houses. You can see our moving the mudslide off with heavy duty hydraulics, but these long poles are along the walls, and they also extended up as drying rack poles. Who's been to the Macaw Museum? You all have. Well, that's good. Now the Macaws reconstructed that house from Hosette, and that's what you walk into in the museum. And then they weathered it for over a year through snowstorms, and we had parties inside to smoke it and get it a little bit aged. And inside the actual house, we found partition boards between family areas that were huge old growth planks. This one's 16 feet long and 4 feet high. But they tied these onto poles in these holes with withe, with those 1-strand strings. And this is the decoration that's on this, which is a gigantic wolf chasing a thunderbird, and the same thing on this side. And these 2 thunderbirds are quite different, so they're probably guardian spirits of different people that are in that family. The story goes that orca, big carnivores of the sea, when they come on land, turn into these giant wolves that then can chase thunderbirds, pursue thunderbirds, which hunt whale with lightning serpents. So it's kind of a vicious circle in terms of the art designs. And of course, whaling's a major industry, 80% by count of the whale bones, 80% of the meat weight was whale, which is much more than they could consume. in the community. So 80% was probably a large part to trade into the Puget Sound, Gulf of Georgia area, north and south. And ropes would have been a major part. This is Wilson Parker with his harpoon and Edward Curtis picture, and his major, his big seal floats. You can see on the float here where the arms of the seal came out, they tie those off, and all the orifices are shut down and blown up. And these drag on the whale. You can see all these floats kind of draped around to keep this dead whale up. And then this individual is trained to jump in and use the withe, those little withe single strand cedar branches I showed you to sew the mouth shut so it doesn't drag. And then again, this is house 1, house 2, and house 3 over here with the whaler with the knob hat coming in and a whale being processed. But these ropes are massive cedar limb ropes. A good illustration of a good shot on a whale. This used to be in the Royal British Columbia Museum. And he's coming right down on the backbone of the whale, the vertebra column, to try to hit the nerve cord. This is in 1906 Macaw, and this is it in 1999, their successful whale hunt being brought in, the whale brought into Nia Bay. The party for 6,000 people, my son and I attended in May of 99. The high school rendered the skeleton and it hangs over the whaling canoes inside the museum now. And part of a Macaw Day celebration of the whaling is shown here. The courts have just approved another step forward to open the way to begin whaling again. The macaws are waiting for this environmental study to be approved and them to be able to begin whaling. This just shows you some of the whaling the art. This is Dr. Richard Doherty, the director of the site, next to this whale saddle, which has 700 teeth inlaid into it to create this gorgeous design on this cedar sculpture. And it's the dorsal fin of an orca, you can see like this one, which is even depicted on basketry. This basket here on the front of the Hosette basket book has orca fin designs. It's thought just because of the way they incorporated those fins onto it as a major icon. And this is the way it's found at Hosette. And when it's put together, you can see, anybody know what kind of smooth molars that they might have used to inlay 700 teeth?
Sea otter?
Close. Yeah. Sea otter. Sea otters are the ones that have the smooth molars like we do. So a lot of sea otters gave up their teeth for this. But you again see the Thunderbird with a single striped feathers holding his lightning serpent, a double-headed serpent in the design here. And other things are trophies. I definitely put whale bones all the way around the house. Here's 2 skulls. You can see them a little better in this picture against the wall. And we find in the Hosette house the harpoon sheaths with the mussel shell blades on them, carefully folded and put in these whale harpoon bags. There were 2 on top of each other. We also find this mussel shell blade embedded into some of the fauna, the whalebone fauna. This was a very good shot. They really hurt the spinal cord with that and probably paralyzed that whale to be dispatched. And that's the shot you really want. And you'll see a lot of these computer drawn maps of the house. So that's 40 feet by 60. These harpoon sheaths with the harpoons are stacked up here because they were found inside of this whale harpoon bag. And so we're trying to control distribution of both basketry and cordage this way. Another thing cordage, of course, is used for is weaving. The Macaws and the lower Elwall here, and the Salish people have these true looms. They aren't hanging looms like the Chilcat blankets. These are true looms with a continuous warp. And of course, these are made with the yarn from a hair dog that they had in great numbers in the village. And we see that archaeologically, a hair dog versus a village dog. And they spun the wool to make these warps. And that's one way. And we found an average of 4 of these looms per the house. So it's a big industry. We found 13 spindle whorls out of wood in each house. So that was a big industry. The other blanket that has more to do with cordage is this down blanket, where there's strings in here, cedar bark strings, and they wrap these strings with bird skins that still have the down on them and create a cord or a boa. And then they twine across this with sinew, and you end up with a very thick down blanket. And over 30 of these were found in terms of the warps, because wet sites won't preserve the skin, they won't preserve the feathers, they won't preserve the sinew, but the cords that are in here, cedarback cords, do preserve. And we found many of these, you can see here, 48 of them around the Hosette house. So they had lots of nice warm blankets out of down with these string warps. And that's separate from all the actual wool blanket weaving. So we'll talk about that a little bit more, but these are all cedar bark string warps, and the feathers are gone, the hide doesn't preserve, and the sinew that bound these together is gone. So all you have are these string warps in great clumps. So in general, you have use of cordage all through the house. You use these withes to tie together the house plank, the poles to hold the planks up. You get mud shoe or snowshoes in the house. Over 1,000 wooden wedges, and a lot of them with cordage collars in the house. Over 1,000 that were recorded. Here's these things are just storage bundles for keeping your roots or your limbs in a compact fashion so you can put them in water later. This is from Boundary Bay, actually, up in Canada. That's 2,000 years old, but these things are very much like how Ed Carrier stores his limbs and roots. You know, these down blankets are common. Nets, usually dip nets. And then we saw this, the brushes are, these are brush symbols. We had the computer do these little symbols back in 1974, which was pretty innovative at the time. But they draw these little brushes all around where they were found in the house in use. We don't know what this is. This is a mystery artifact, but it's a cedar bark that's wrapped around, making a kind of a bun. And they're found here and there around the site. And then braids are real common as well. Cedar bark braids make up about 1/4 of the cordage, but they're usually part of other things like the edge of cedar bark mats or the end of tump lines or cords to tie in the baby in a cradle. So very diagnostic, not over discuss this, but you have all these attributes that are definitely cultural. I've worked with the weavers, and they definitely go through the process of preparing and getting the materials. Construction techniques typically are twisting or braiding or just straps that are used for binding usually. All kinds of forms. You get nets and wedge collars and loops, like the loops, or even handles, basket handles like Duncan found, and a whole series of knotting techniques. Usually this is a whipping to keep the cordage from come apart, and this is sheet bend for tying in the house poles to hold up the boards. Square knots are a non-slip knot, and almost every net for 5,000 years found in archaeological sites are done with this hand-done square knot, and hitches for tying on to things and whipping to finish your rope off. And then I classified them by those characteristics. So you see a quarter of the artifacts, 483 from Hosette, are these single strand withes like I showed you earlier. And then you get into cedar bow, usually Zlay, 14% only, 14 or 1% are S-laid. Then 3 strand, 140, which are all Z-laid. Then the brushes are their own classes. Usually they're, like I showed you, cedar twigs that are split and braided. But you also see spruce twigs and hemlock twigs, only one of each. So what could this be? Any ideas? This is a mystery artifact. It's kind of like a big cedar bark bun. Some people make these as a cushion to put things on their head to walk with. Some elders think they might be toys for paddling back and forth with a paddle board, like as a game. They're also, cedar bark is an absorbent, so it could be something as an absorbent of some sort. Any ideas? Anybody want to?
Hey, Dale,
Yes.
how big are they?
What's that?
How big are they?
Oh, good question. This would be 1 inch. These 3 squares are half of a centimeter. There's 2.5 centimeters to be 1 inch. So this is about, getting close to 2 inches. That's about the typical size. You can see they're all over. But very few are found in use. Usually they're found discarded. This one was in use in the house. Any thoughts?
Could it be a top knot from a hat?
Yeah, that isn't a bad idea. They definitely talk about putting things in the knob of your hat, and that would sure be a good way to strengthen it. What I've heard, which is more spiritual in nature, is that they put quartz crystals in the knob as part of that, guardian spirit thing, or to help the elder. But this would work good in the knob. Yeah. Any other ideas? Anyway, it's interesting. But you find, and then the elders, like I say, they do find cedar paddle boards that you could, like badminton or table tennis. You could.
Dale, how many have been found?
Not a whole lot. This is about it. There's 12, I think, or 13. So maybe Duncan will find one there. But I think Hosette has some. And they're both villages. That might be part of a domestic, so it's a domestic thing. All right. Well, anyway, think about it. And let's just quickly talk about this important characteristic really of how the world works, actually, the direction you lay your cordage. And Susan Point let us use this image on the back of the book, but you can see she's doing the traditional Zlay. That it's hard to see, but it goes like that. This would go like that. So it's Zlay, and to get a Zlay, you got to turn these two elements clockwise, and then to get the Zlay, you have to lay them together so they're spring-loaded counterclockwise, and that's the typical Northwest Coast direction is counterclockwise. So the single strands have to be twisted clockwise, but when you put the single strands together, they're laid counterclockwise. If you do S twist, which can easily be, done, but is not considered the correct way, obviously, on the coast, if everything's pretty much Z-lay, then you do these single elements counterclockwise, and you lay them together clockwise. And Hillary shows it here with cedar bark strings being made, and in Macaw tradition, it's done by the toe. Other people use their hip. Jan, you might use your hip to do cordage, I don't know. But she sews these things going together with a Z-lay. So, each of these are twisted clockwise, and then you're laying them together counterclockwise to get the spring load and then the strands. So S is this way, but Z is the typical one. And she shows it here too. You go clockwise and then you lay them together counterclockwise, and 3-strand too. Now, what I'm trying to point out here is this is not just with cordage. The Northwest Coast is traditionally sees the world, particularly in the Central Coast, as I should say Central Coast, as going counterclockwise. So the ethnographies show this counterclockwise, but on the coast, when you make cordage, you do it. When you're weaving a basket, you're going counterclockwise around the top. Your twining is counterclockwise. And the direction you dance around the house floor is counterclockwise. And as you come into the dance floor, you do a circle, which is counterclockwise. And when you leave the floor, you do a counterclockwise circle. You do a turn, complete 180-degree turn. So there's a real preference in cordage, basketry, dancing, and how the world works best. And I saw this explained by Wayne Settles, who's a major anthropologist, and he works with a musqueam. Is Bob on? Bob is a musqueam. Tucker? But anyway, Wayne, I knew, had stated somewhere linguistically that the proper direction is counterclockwise, and I just couldn't find that quote. So I called his son, Cameron, and do you know where your dad had, because he has his archives, has a statement about going counterclockwise. I was looking in the wrong place, and the next day I got it from him in the in his work with the Coast Salish Musqueam grammar. He points out that the ceremonial circuit is counterclockwise. Participants in the winter dance move around the house in a counterclockwise direction. Participants in a shaker service proceed around the church to shake each other's hand and pass before the prayer table in a counterclockwise direction. I was at a memorial at Squaxin, and the Shaker Church priest or preacher, she came up to do the prayer, did a counterclockwise circle, gave the prayer, and then did a counterclockwise circle as she was leaving. Wayne points out to move clockwise is this term, which actually means to bind oneself, to get bound. And to move counterclockwise is to get free, free it, untie it. Thus, if you move clockwise, you're tying yourself up. But if you move counterclockwise, you're freeing yourself. So it's the way the world goes for the coast, central coast. That's both Wakashan and Salish. The ceremonial circuit in this region contrasts with much of the rest of native North America. For some reason, the rest of native North America is everything's clockwise. So I'd argue that this Zlay that we see, the direction that you weave a basket and move around a dance movement in the dance is consistent with the northwest coast worldview going the correct counterclockwise direction, has been for at least 3,000 years. Any comments about that? But it just seems to go together that that's the way their world goes. We're a very clockwise world. Euro-Americans and the West, but they seem to see the world going counterclockwise. Okay, let's get back to these warp strings because there is a curious difference here. These things that are found in great numbers that I think are duck down blankets. Most of these hundreds of strings are S-laid. So it just blew me away. Why is all these strings that are warps in these down blankets S instead of Z? A big difference. And this doesn't show up in other kinds of cordage artifacts. And these things are explained, and this is actually one of a number of blankets collected by James Swan in 1866. And I saw two of them at the Smithsonian. He states blankets are made of feathers, or rather down. The method of manufacturing is select a bird which has plenty of down and first pick out all the feathers, carefully to skin it, and then dry the skins with down on. When you have a sufficient number prepared, they are slightly moistened, then cut into narrow strips, each one which is twisted around a thread, cedar bark string thread, leaving the down on the outside. So these are cords with down around the string, which thus forms a round cord of down resembling a lady's fur boa, very nice and thick. This is woven with twine and probably sinew from what I could tell at the Smithsonian, and forms a compact, light, and very warm blanket. And they're all over the house. And I was thinking about this. These are all S-laid, but if you want that skin with the duck down on it to purchase, if you want that, to really hold on to that string, you're going to want these to be S-laid so that you can correctly wrap that skin around that string counterclockwise to get it to, essentially spring load. So your end product is done counterclockwise, these long boas of duck skin that then are twined together with sinew. So then it made sense these were S-laid because you'd want it to be the opposite direction, that final part of it, the duck skins with the down are put on, should then purchase by going counterclockwise and finish the construction of these boas anyway with the correct direction. Lots of other things cordage are used on wood splitting wedges that have been on the coast as a major construction technique for a Cookwass for about 10,500 years. Lots of wedges found there. Over 1,000 found in the Hosette house. So all these are collars that would go around the top to keep the wedge from splitting as you're pounding it into the log to split off a plank or to split out a canoe or even to split firewood for the house. These are sunken village, but you can see again the Zlay of the collar around the wedge. Braids are used for a number of things. This is a cradle construction at Hosette where you have a stick along the cedar bark checkerwork. And then you run braids to create loops, kind of like the loop maybe used on the basket that Duncan's finding where those loops are opposite so you can tie in the contents, in this case, the baby. This is actually one from Mudslide, Cookwass, and it's not cedar bark. And we should check others, but this is big leaf maple bark is being used to make their braids, which might be the case at Hosette. We should check some of these in a cellular analysis just to see if they're cedar bark or not. And then another braid aspect is the end of a tump line that you find around the house. But the main thing is to make braids on the edge of your big mats. And this is a huge cedar bark mat on the bed platform. And these edges are braids that are wrapped around and then the weave goes back and then it wraps around and goes back and wraps around. So you see the braid pieces are all around this plank house. But you look at the fragments, they also of mats, mat fragments, there's hundreds of them, kind of follow along where the braids are, you know, over up here. So these things might be just mats that are coming apart and leaving little pieces of braid. This actually is house 2's wall here, so it's a continuation of the braids along the wall. And then of course, tump lines are a good source for braids, and parts of them are found all over the house for carrying your basket. We went through these brushes, quite a few of them in the house, 76. And again, what you find in these ancient pieces are the braid, but only the center stalk of only the center piece of that branchlet is preserved. So you can see the centerpiece, but these little branchlets of has broken off. And so very common thing for keeping the house brushed and the floors swept, and these are all around a family hearth. So we actually found a basket full of boiling stones. So they very well could be used to brush the soot off the rocks before you put them into the box full of water to boil some dried food. Cherry bark is a common binding cordage. You can see it at most sites, but for some reason, Cookwass had a lot of it. And I think southern Puget Sound, that site, Mud Bay, was used as a quarry. There's lots of cherry trees. This is Cookwass. And the only composite tool we found at Cookwass is this very small war club, a toy with a cedar stick and a cherry bark nicely bound around and holding a green stone, this green stone onto the stick. Very small, this is about an inch and a half maybe. And you know, some kid lost their war club, their toy. And it's one of the neatest artifacts we found at the site. Ed showed us how to harvest this. You actually pull the cherry bark off the outer layer of the tree and you leave that cambium, the inner layer in, so it doesn't kill the tree if you take this bark all the way off, because the inner layer for nutrients passing up into the tree is still there. And these are the wrapping for the lanyard here of the whale harpoon. And we found these without the sinew that would have been inside these lanyards. But we find the wrapping near those harpoon pouches I showed you. And these are probably used to bound together sections of the harpoon itself that's curved. So you can get a long harpoon by putting sections together. Other places we find cherry bark to bind microblades at Hoko on end hafted like that. It's a very, it's like a little bit like elastic. It stretches and it'll bind on real well, and it doesn't shrink or swell if you get this wet. So that's cord crystal braid. And another common use for these typical net anchor stones at beater boast, and so that's cherry bark to hold this unmodified pebble between split stick to hang off the bottom of a net. This looks a lot like what you found, Duncan, up the Fraser, and we see them as the main sewing element for Thule mats at Hoko. You know, there's 11 of these partial mats found at Hoko, and they're sewing that's Thule stems together with these threads. And these are probably common at that fishing station to go over the pole structure as your wall materials, as well as here's a replicated mat, as well as covering canoes to keep them out of the sun and for bedding. These are done every 5 centimeters. So it takes 90 feet of this string to make one Thule mat. And if you have 10 mats over your house, that's 900 feet. So you were making a lot of this cordage for sewing mats. They're also seen in shredded cedar bark capes from this 3,000-year-old site at Hoko, where the strings are bound over to make the skirt of the cape here, with a string inside there. And also you find them at a Hosette on anchor stones that are grooved, and that's probably spruce root cordage. And we replicated those mats as one of our projects. So here's the Macaw Museum and some, actually the director, Janine Beauchop, helping us gather spruce roots, make the string, very narrow strings, and sew together these mats. We also found this at Hoko, a mat creaser carved out of cedar. This is the ancient one that's about 2,800 years old, and you use it to run over the sewing needle to crimp it so the strings don't split out the tules up and down. So this crimp kind of holds the string in place. And this has a groove in it for running over the needle. And you can see once we freeze dried this carving, which is 2 kingfishers creating the handle, had paint on it. It's the oldest wood sculptured painted art on the coast. So that's a black, and the eyes are black. And a student of Bill Holmes did a replica of it. And he's one that noticed the paint. I couldn't tell before it was freeze dried. There really was paint on it. And nets are not uncommon in most sites. Here's a 5,000-year-old one up on Baranof Island. Hoko, we had a 3,000-year-old monofilament net. These are spruce root splints, just single strands, not plied. So it's monofilament tied to an anchor stone. Twisted cordage from Musqueam, a nice gill net there. And Mud Bay here, Cookwass had nets, but they're made again out of big leaf maple bark, not cedar bark. And so one thing I found interesting about the prehistoric 3-strand hunky harpoon lines. They're very common at 3,000 years ago in the Gulf of Georgia area. They find them at Musqueam with harpoon shafts, but these are very nice 3-strand cedar bough rope, harpoon ropes from 3,000 years ago. They just found this beautiful harpoon line at a 2,000-year-old site at Boundary Bay. And Taya Williams is the archaeological coordinator from Musqueam. And we have a Musqueam member, Bob's on, but she would know Tia. But these things are found that old, 2,000 and 3,000 years ago in the Fraser Delta. But in 9 seasons of excavating Hoko, never did we find any of these large cedar bough 3-strand ropes, which I find very curious, because after 9 years of heavy excavations, you'd think we'd find a little bit of this, we'd find a piece or two of this kind of gauge harpoon line, which are so common in the Fraser Delta 2,000 and 3,000 years ago, contemporary to Hoko. But we definitely see it at Hosette, where it's being used for whale harpoon lines. So I find it curious, we just don't find it at 3,000-year-old site at Hoko, and you do at Musqueam and Boundary Bay. So something's going on in the interior where they're really doing some big ropes that if used as harpoons are probably for sea mammals, but not whales necessarily, but sea lions and seals on the Delta.
Maybe for sturgeon.
Yeah, or sturgeon. Yeah, that makes good sense. So we went and did a different kind of test to see how the cordage clustered together and from different sites. It's called Bayesian. And the beauty of this is you can use temporal data. You can put in the date of the site and a few of the other things. And I had help doing this, but this new test, which is to test other tests I've done for 40 years, seem to reflect that clustering where you get this outer West Coast style of cordage, you get this Puget Sound, Gulf of Georgia, which picks up Sunken Village down here because it just doesn't know where to be placed. There's no other sites in the Columbia Basin. And then it clusters these northern sites of Hosette and LeCaine. So, through time, the scientific approach is test your hypothesis. But I'd say after 40 years of testing this, it really does show that cordage and basketry in particular shows a long-term continuity of ethnicity. In this case, Salish and in the Puget Sound, Gulf of Georgia, and in our West Coast area. A West Coast style is very distinct from Puget Sound. And Eric, the guy that did the Bayesian work for us and we published in the cordage book, says, the outcome of the tree is that strong regional traditions exist in cordage subtypes, and they appear to remain very constant over very long periods of time. So basketry and cordage is probably identity, and it's transmitted vertically through cultural transmission, again, generationally linked archaeology, and it complements the generally follows previous hypotheses of regional continuity. So it's good to try these different tests and see how they work. So thank you for staying with me, I think, a lot of you. And I'd like to open it up for any questions or discussion. I'll turn that off.
Dale,
Yeah.
David here. One thing I have noticed over 50 years of observation in powwows in the plateau and in the Great Plains is that you have both counterclockwise and clockwise dancing. And counterclockwise dancing occurs most frequently for ceremonial and sacred things, and clockwise is social.
Oh, who's this?
David Mansell.
I mean, who does that?
This is Plateau and the Great
Oh.
Plains.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, like I say, we see a little of each, but it usually has an explanation. So I think possibly, you know, the change from S to Z twist in the Vantage area could be something they just said that you needed to start doing, but it usually means it's a different tradition coming in.
Yes,
But yeah, Plateau, you know, everybody, like I say, that wouldn't surprise me because the rest of native North America is clockwise. So incorporating both, maybe something actually being picked up from further east.
well, what I think that there's, the difference is that one is social and one is spiritual,
I see.
and that's the difference.
Yeah, I mean, it's not unlikely that if you were, say, an Indian doctor or shaman, that going clockwise, even though you're binding yourself up, might be the way you go to the other world too.
Yes, possibly. Anyway, and you might think about chocat blanket weaving.
Right.
Chocat blanket weaving is wool around cedar.
Oh, well, it's yeah, it is. Yeah, twined over cedar strings.
Right, exactly.
And I've shared a lot of this with the Salish Bass, you know, the Tlingit weavers up north. Evelyn, you know, is Evelyn, I can't pronounce her last name, Vanderhoop. Haven't got a reply from her, but I thought about that. You know, these strings could be hanging strings, and you could use wool to twine them into blankets. But usually, if you're using wool, you use the true loom and you do the plaiting. You know, the twill work. And really, the only blankets that seem to reflect this found in, and this isn't just James Swan, but there's a number of those duck down blankets that were collected in this area. But so I think my thought is that those are wrapped
Mhm.
duck skins.
They probably are.
We just, you know, it's not impossible those warp strings would have been somehow just a hanging loom, but if you have a true loom, or you could warp the true loom with cedar strings and then do wool through it in a plating like a twill. But normally they want a fully, you know, wool blanket if they're doing the true loom. Any other questions? Get the gallery going here. Lori, are you there, Tucker? Anyway, Bob is from Musqueam, so I'm sure he's interested in that boundary base.
Yes, we're here.
Hi, Lori.
Hello.
Hi, Dale.
Hi, Bob. How are you doing?
We're well, thanks.
Good.
We were concurring that everything we've seen has been counterclockwise in ceremonies.
Is it? Yeah.
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
it's still strong Coast Salish, but I also think everything I've seen out on the West Coast too, pretty much is counterclockwise. But I find it interesting that, you know, if I wove the blanket clockwise with the weavers in Neobay, they would have taken it from me and undone it. And it would have, and then they would have done it correctly, counterclockwise, until they thought I had learned by observation that that's the way to do it. And it's true with twining too. I twined just, you know, it wasn't necessarily, cricket, but I twined my basket the wrong way, or with a clockwise twine, which is easy to do. The Tlingit hiders do that. And they took it away from me and undid it and then did it counterclockwise twining. And when they felt like it, gave it back to me and watched to make sure I did it right, or they'd take it away again. So there's a right way to do it. You know, I've learned in working with a lot of these master weavers. You know, and so there's, you know, I think that observation by Wayne Suttles is a pretty good one in talking about the way the world works and why that term means freeing yourself up. Duncan, do you have any ideas?
Well, I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm wondering about splicing. Obviously, if you have a number of cedar boughs,
Right.
Incorporated into cordage, you have to splice it in,
Right.
As well as the ends, whether you're making loops or or even an odd end, you may want to splice it.
Yeah, it's not unlike basketry. You do a lot of splicing too, or you expand the weave. But the cordage, before you get to the end of one of the strands, even if it's, you know, 3 or 4 strands, you lay another piece of cordage element, you know, another cedar bough that's twisted. You lay the thin end and you work them together till you get to the end of that other one, and then you know, so splicing is not sticking it through the weave. It's just laying them along and each alongside each other and twisting them together until you come to the end of the old one and it continues with the new one. You know, you have to do it correctly so it doesn't, you know, come apart, but it's a real common thing to do, is just to lay an element against the ending one, and by the time, you know, they're spring loaded anyway, and they'll continue and be just fine. You know, you already have 2 strands where you're splicing. You'll have plenty of strength there to splice in and continue the lay or the twisting.
And so most of the bough cordage that you see is the boughs have been split.
No, they're usually whole. So this is a whole limb, and you don't split it. You just twist it, and I would just then, you know, and you have to be pretty strong. I mean, you know, I worked with some Quileutes that made whale harpoons in the old way, and so you use a whole limb, and then you would essentially lay 3 together, and you'd work them together and then build it out, and then make sure it stays the same thickness, and that requires, again, splicing in and making sure you retain that hunky whale harpoon thickness, you know, like this. This is cedar bark, but you essentially have to. I can probably show you, Duncan, a splicer somewhere. Maybe not. It's, of course, cedar bark's a little easier to connect in, but you know, there's got to be several splices in this, but you really can't see them. They're just laying an element alongside or wrapping them together. That's probably a splice right there, or an end of a splice, and then just incorporating it in to keep the thickness going. And so splicing is never tying into it or running the element into the twist and then bringing it in. And that's pretty well the case when you're doing basketry, because you're always having to add elements, but you make sure there's plenty of twines or plenty of stitches together before the old one ends, and then it's got to be the same thickness and continue. you know, Ed Carrier watches that very carefully. Everything has to be looking good. So he'll incorporate a new warp way down in the weave and weave them together. And when he gets to a certain point, he pulls them apart so they become two warps, but they're well anchored and then continue around the basket. But he's a master. He makes sure everything looks perfect. And if it's not, he'll take it apart and do it over, you know, it doesn't matter how many times. So it's, you know, the making of these things is really what's important to usually these artisans, whether it's basketry or cordage. If Ed's making a net, it's the making of the net, not finishing it, that really is the important thing. You know, time doesn't mean anything. It's a different way of looking at it, and he you know, never really cares about when it's finished as much, because there's an afterlife. Then the basket is sold or it goes into a whole different realm, but making the basket is what's important, and it's the real life of the basket or the cordage or the net. So the weavers don't care how much time it takes, it's just doing it. We tend, I mean, I worked with Isabel Itis for 30 years, master weaver out of Nia Bay. And we'd work at her house. And every time somebody from the West would come in, just invariably somebody would say, how long does it take to make that basket? And she never told anybody. She never answered that question. It didn't matter. And if they kept pressing and kept pressing, she'd finally just say, well, it takes a week, or it takes 2 weeks to do it. But they never think of it as finishing it and having an end product, which is nice to have and show people your final thing, but it's the doing that matters. It's a whole different tradition too in learning. They don't explain anything, and you have to learn strictly by signaling, by observation. You never are explained anything. And that's a whole different thing. It's Ed says, Ed Carrier, we're learning from his great grandmother to weave baskets. He said if he asked her to explain something, he'd be in trouble. He'd be in big trouble. You just didn't do it. You just watched and learned and did it as learn from observation. You know, and we tend to, in the West, think of that as, and I've worked with, you know, willow wicker weavers from Austria, and a master weaver. Everything's measured, everything's explained. It's kind of like our science. That's the way we do things. But that isn't the way you necessarily train in other cultures. It's, and certainly with you know, Macaw and Salish basket weaving, it's all by observation. You really don't. I mean, it's okay if I do it or I make a mistake and they redo it, because I'm outside. I'm an outsider. But if you're, you know, if you're family and you ask the questions, you can be in big trouble. You know, Ed would talk about, well, I would split the cedar limbs and I'd get the limbs and I'd try to learn to make the warps and the wefts and leave it. And then the next day I'd come in and the ones that his great grandmother threw in the yard, he knew were no good. And he'd go out and look at those so he could learn what the bad ones were, so he wouldn't do that again. But that's never explained. I don't know. I'm going on and on with this, but that is, I think, an interesting aspect of cultural transmission. It can be all done by, you know, signaling, not by necessarily symbolic communication. Any comments about that? Well, anyway, I sure appreciate everybody's sticking with us, and I think we have some pretty good programs coming up. I'll try to get out a newsletter in actual paper, you know, so you can every once in a while get that information. But does it work okay, you know, as attachments?
Works fine.
Yeah,
Okay, thanks.
it works fine.
Yeah, well, good. You know, so it's kind of forced to do less of the, you know, in-house meetings, but you know, might get to be where we can do one once in a while just to celebrate Christmas or something. But it is not happening for a while, I don't think. The Northwest meetings, Beth Matthews was chair of that last year, and I think a lot of you heard that's going to be virtual again. We're not going to have a location. Beth, you want to say anything about that? Anyway, there's Beth.
Oh, am I muted now?
We're just talking about the Northwest meetings probably are going to be virtual again.
Yeah, sorry, part of the feed cut out. I think probably you asked me something. Yeah, virtual in next year in March, and then hopefully back to in person after that, but we don't know.
Yeah, I think it's going to get there, slow but sure. Okay, well, again, if you have a chance, if you know, have an interest in getting the book, it's not that expensive, and I'd be happy to write a insert into it. So just send me an email, and I'll send it, you know, an address so I can send you a insert sign in it.
Well, Dale, this is David here. I just want to say, I just want to say thank you very much for a very good presentation.
Well, thanks, David. David has the book.
Very true. It's a gift.
It was a nice exchange of gifts. Well, thanks, and have a good evening, and I'll get your word out about President John Blong's. And Duncan, let me know if I can help any with your new finds. You know, just send pictures. I'll be happy to just tell you what I can. But I think those double loops on that basket handle is a real Salish type thing to do. You know, handles are pretty specific to different cultural traditions.
Right on, nice, Dale.
Yep.
Thanks much, Dale. That was very cool. I enjoyed it a lot.
Who's this?
Jan Smith.
Oh, yeah. Thanks, Jan. And tell Carl hi.
I will do that. And
Right.
I'll try to catch the next meeting as well. Bye-bye.
Yeah. I got your email.
Dale, David here again.
Yes.
I was talking to Laura Phillips up at the Burke Museum,
Uh-huh.
and they were looking at the Wapato hat that I had from Wapato Creek there in Tacoma.
Right.
And they found out that there's red ochre paint on the hat.
What is there?
There's red ochre paint on the hat.
Huh. Yeah. Yeah,
And-
that's interesting.
And they haven't been able to identify how much of it there is, but it is on the hat. So
Yeah.
it was decorated.
Well, we have some from Hosette that way too, that are spruce root hats, probably traded in from the north Lincoln Haida area, but the rim has paint on them. And it really was a pretty good way to make them more waterproof.
Yes.
Yeah, that's neat.
Okay. Good
Dale,
night.
I have a question about those buns.
Okay, Priscilla.
Were they just bits and pieces of material, or was it a continuous piece of material?
Yeah, it was fairly continuous. You know, we've never opened them up to see if there's a cord inside that you wrap around. But But you'd think there'd be something that you wrapped around to get it going and build it up, you know, whether it's a cord or a circular strip of cedar bark. It just looks like it's wrapped around and around and around and around all the way around and built up until it gets to that 2 or 3 inch size. Or
Seems like they would have had a mold of some kind. Could you stick your finger through the middle?
no, not really. No, you fill in the middle, you know, with the wrapping. And it's strange, there's not a lot of them in use in the house. They seem to be discarded in the midden. You know, you find things that are preserved that are on the outside midden or in the house floor itself, under the house floors.
So maybe it was the tail end of something.
Excuse me?
Maybe it was just the tail end of something and they just threw them out.
Yeah, it's not impossible. Yeah. So, yeah, that could be, or somehow they used them until they didn't want to use them anymore and discarded them. There's only one. There's one that's a cedar bark braid that's wrapped around and made into a bun. So it's not just single layer strips. It's a little braid that's wrapped around and around and around and made into a bun. Little fancier.
Somebody just said in your chat, it could have been a scrubber.
Could be. Yeah. Yeah, it could be some kind of a scrubber, maybe for cleaning and, you know, yourself or a baby or something like that.
And then maybe if it got too icky, then they just threw it out.
Yeah, that could be. It you know, the cradles are found with shredded cedar bark and moss and things as an absorbent, you know, in the cradle. So, you know, that kind of a thing might be an absorbent that you use to wipe off the baby or something. I don't know. Thank God we never found any babies, you know, in cradles. You know, it's not impossible with a mudslide like that. But I was dreading that possibility, but we never did.
Interesting that those cradles would have been single use.
Yeah, that is neat to hear from, you know, David, and also the fact that Duncan, that's what they find, the main thing they find. And I know with a Squaxin, you kind of, things when their life is over for use with the child, you know, or including at the beginning, your umbilical cord is put in a special split tree and handled by an Indian doctor, you know, so it's could be something like that. But, you know, you always hear, you know, other Western cultures where cradles are floating in the river, but usually with babies in them. So, but it's a curious tradition, and it might have something to do with the life of it's over. It's like I say, when they're through with a basket, it's called, or a lot of times carvings are considered, once they're done, it's the afterlife. You know, it's not really the important part as carving the sculpture or making the basket, and or in this case, using the cradle. It might be an afterlife where it's best not to have it around, or it's best for the child's welfare to properly move it its afterlife somewhere else.
Maybe if the child died, they would get rid of it.
Excuse me again?
Maybe if the child died, it would be a reason to get rid of it.
That's certainly a possibility, yeah. Yeah, I'm sure that'd be a possibility with, you know, this, the Indian doctor handling it. But, you know, the umbilical cord means you're properly placing it to help the child in the future.
I really enjoyed your talk.
Well, thanks, Priscilla. I'm glad you did. And Glad we can still get together like this.
Make a couple of those brushes.
Yeah, thanks, Tom.
I think I recognized Dick Doherty on the cover of one of those books you had.
Yeah. Yeah, you saw him in the picture by that,
The orca fin.
yeah, the Orca, the whale saddle, they call it. Certainly a major find. He was amazing, and so was his wife. Well, both of his wives were, but he remarried Ruth
Ruth.
Kirk, married Ruth, and Ruth very gallantly wrote a major summary of Hosette that came out not too long ago. But we used to get together for lunch about every couple of weeks.
I miss her.
Yeah, she's a good friend and certainly very talented.
Yeah.
Are you a friend of Ruth's?
Yes.
Yeah.
We, Tom and I and Dick Miller and his wife attended their wedding at the Longhouse at the reservation.
Oh, I was there. Yeah.
Were you there too? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm
they
sure.
were at a wedding they had it in the museum in the Longhouse.
Yeah.
And it was presided by Gary Wesson, an archaeologist. Gary Wesson did the ceremony.
That was very interesting.
Yeah, he's an amazing individual and really was early in working with tribes so directly. You know, he always emphasized to his students that we work in equal partnership with tribes. And that was not
Right.
done in the 70s and 80s.
Hmm.
But it was so
Right.
important, and we carried that tradition on when we went into the future. But one of my favorite parts of that was Dick. Well, when they found out I was the graduate student doing the basketry, the leadership of the Macaw said, well, you can't understand those baskets unless you work with our master weavers at the school and learn Macaw basketry. And I really hesitated. I didn't think I had to do that to learn, to do the science. And Dick said, well, we're an equal partnership, and that's their part. And you're going to spend a semester in Neanderthal weaving baskets for 2 hours a day.
And aren't you glad you did?
Oh, that was the best class. You couldn't get a class like that anywhere in the world in anthropology. No, I was truly wrong on that count, that I learned so much about, just.
Well, the cultural side as much as
Yeah.
the science. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I say those attributes I use were directly from working with the weavers. They said these are the important things in putting that basket or cordage together. And so, he was pretty progressive in the sense of working with tribes. He was an ethnographer earlier before he became an archaeologist, and he worked with a whole tribe. He wrote up some papers on the whole Indians. But
Well, the Macaws have him to thank for getting that museum there instead of in the Smithsonian.
you're exactly right. Yeah, that was again, equal partnership thing. The tribes made it real clear we don't want any of these artifacts, leaving the reservation. We don't want them in Seattle at the Burke or anything else.
no, that's good.
Yeah, and he said, "Well, that's your part of it, and we'll certainly make that happen as far as working with you on our side." And he did do a lot to get these different legislators to do the funding of that museum in Nia Bay. And so, yeah, he is very keen on working in equal partnership with tribes. That you always had turmoil, as just the way it is, but usually in the end it's for the better because you both learn so much from each other. And they have the cultural knowledge. They really have more than we would necessarily recognize until we do work with them and realize that it's own, and then it's owned by them as much as it's the science even is owned as much by them as us. And so you know, I didn't have to do anything but take those classes, you know, normally an anthropologist would have to some. Of course, I worked for 30 years helping Isabel, you know. And I learned my role there too from you know, the principal of the school is David Whitener, who the Weaver said, oh, we have an Indian principal now. And I said, well, where is he from? And they said, oh, he's Squaxin. And I said, well, where is that? I had no idea where it was. And I have a clue, and they explained it to me. And then he had me come to his office, and then he listened to what I was doing, and he said, well, you're going to get here before the class starts, and you're going to get them their coffee and their homemade cinnamon roll from the cafeteria before class starts, or you're going to be tardy, and you're going to do, you know, I was learning that these elders were the leaders of the whole community, and you better be very sure they get everything they need while you're at class. And or he said, or if you don't, you're out of here.
Right.
But they yeah. And then they made sure I understood that I could learn this because I needed to understand Hosette, but that I could never make macaw baskets and sell them, and I could never teach macaw style basketry. And then I knew, yeah, this stuff's guarded, you know, it's something that's identity. So they are making sure that I will not teach it or profit by it.
Could you record, I mean, you must have recorded it in publications. I mean, is it published, or I mean, can you look it up, or how is it recorded other than just hand-me-down culture then?
I guess through that Hosette book, but I certainly expanded on that working with Ed Carrier, you know, that's certainly published in terms of how we got together and how we worked together and how we were, you know, that book that I did with Ed is half his voice, you know, and that's not done very often. I had to transcribe, he had to reread it several times and every word to make sure it was correct. And so that book's half his voice, and we're still working on stuff like that. But with Isabel, there's quite a bit of that recorded too in different publications and volumes.
Well, a dead culture is not much use. It's better to have a live one.
What's that again?
I say it's better to have a live culture than a dead one.
Yeah. Well, and then bringing the past culture into the learning traditions of the future. And Ed has a really good apprentice who's Squaxin, a young guy, and that's real important.
Yeah.
And they really wanted to know at NEA that was happening if I'm you know, nominating him to be a National Heritage Fellowship person. It was very important that I really showed that he had an apprentice and that was going to be carried on, and how the book would carry it on a bit too. But he's unique in that he was very excited to go into the Bark Museum and look at those baskets and replicate them and learn from them, and no other master basket weaver has had that urge. He's unique with the way he operates in terms of following his urge. And that's how he got into basketry, because the other thing is his great grandmother isn't going to force him to weave, and that's not a traditional West Coast or Macaw or Salish thing to do. You have to have the urge. Unfortunately, he had the urge because Julia Jacob, his great grandmother's, you know, daughters and granddaughters didn't. So they didn't, like Ed's mom didn't have the urge to do that, but he did. And so
Thank goodness.
that's the way you get into basket weaving. You aren't forced. And then they're not going to tell you anything, but you just have to learn by trial and error. But he really had the urge, and he had the urge to go in and look at the archaeological baskets and learn from his, 200th grandparent, really, or 100th grandparent.
Yeah,
He knew that. He knew that this 2,000-year-old basket from Beetleborgs, the person who made it, whether, whoever that was, he was a master, really was a good weaver, and had to be related to him, because, you go back 100 generations in that kind of a community, that person has to be related to you, through the female.
Right. There weren't
Right.
that many.
Through the
Right.
generations of grandparent to grandparent on. Anybody that's Salish or probably even Macaw is related to that person, that is your 100th grandparent. And he learned from her too, because it was tough doing her work or his work. I'm saying her, but it doesn't matter if you're male or female to Salish or Macaw. Yeah, it doesn't matter gender wise for basket weaving. It's different in other parts of native North America, but here it doesn't matter at all. So anyway, she or he, this person, he felt when it was having a rough time would help him, guide his hands, make sure he finally got it as good as that person did, the fine weave. And we see it as reawakening the fact that that person was a major master 2,000 years ago and recognized for sure in her community, because it's the only basketry from that time period that's that well made, high, and there's certainly baskets that are similar at Fraser River sites, but nothing that fine. And so we reawaken that person's our understanding of this is a master, even though it's from 2,000 years ago. This was a master weaver who should be recognized into the future.
Well, good for you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions? Well, thanks for participating and asking such good questions. And we'll have, Duncan just became a member, so we'll have him report how the future of that site goes, maybe down the road. Or, Duncan's does a lot of work with the earliest people on the coast too. He's the one that was involved with the footprints found that dated full far back. So we should have him, we'll corral him into doing a talk down the road. That work, Duncan?
Sounds good. Mostly I'd like to present on the ice patch finds from Mounted Zaida.
For what?
The ice patch finds at Mounted Zaida.
Yeah. I don't hear very well. I didn't quite catch that. The what? The
Ice patch archaeology at Mounted Zaida.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, that would be a real good talk, and then you could bring in other things you're doing. Thanks for showing those pictures. You got any more?
Not at my fingertips.
All right. Well, thanks again. And Tyler, I might need your help putting up that Starlink out at Holco.
Okay.
I think we lost. Matt's probably gone to bed. It's an hour later in Utah.
Oh, that's right. He's on his great journey.
Yeah, he is. He'll be back for the next talk. John Blong. Okay, well, good night. And we'll see you next time. Thanks.
Good night, Al.
Bye.